Marcus Mac Calloway had been riding alone for 3 years, ever since the fire that took his ranch, his wife, and every reason he'd had to stay in one place. Now he drifted through the Colorado territory like tumbleweed, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough for anyone to ask questions about the burn scars on his hands or the hollowness in his dark eyes. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Mac sat by his small campfire in a valley sheltered by towering pines, coffee warming his calloused palms as he watched his faithful horse, Rusty, graze nearby. The old sorrel gelding was getting on in years, but he'd been Mac's only constant companion through the wandering, never questioning the aimless direction of their travels. "Another day, another trail, eh, boy?" Mac said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. Sometimes Rusty was the only living thing he spoke to for weeks at a time. The Colorado high country in early autumn was painted in gold and crimson, aspen leaves catching the morning light like scattered coins. It was beautiful country, the kind that could make a man believe in fresh starts if he hadn't learned better. Mac had learned better. He was breaking camp, preparing for another day of purposeless wandering, when he heard it, hoofbeats approaching from the east, moving at a pace that wasn't quite flight but wasn't casual either. Mac's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, old habits from more dangerous times asserting themselves. What emerged from the tree line made him freeze with astonishment. A wild horse unlike any he'd ever seen was approaching his camp. The stallion was magnificent, coal-black with a white blaze down his face and 3 white socks. But it was the animal's condition that struck Mac first. The horse was covered in dust and trail dirt, his coat dulled by hard travel. Fresh cuts and old scars marked his hide, telling stories of battles fought and dangers survived. "Easy there," Mac murmured, though the horse was still 50 yards away. "Just passing through, are you?" But the stallion wasn't passing through. He approached steadily, his dark eyes fixed on Mac with an intensity that was almost human in its directness. There was no fear in those eyes, no wild panic that Mac expected from an unbroken horse encountering a human. Instead, there was something that looked disturbingly like purpose. 20 feet from Mac's camp, the horse stopped. For a long moment, man and animal regarded each other in the crisp mountain air. Mac could see the intelligence in the stallion's gaze, the careful assessment of threat and opportunity that marked a survivor. Then the horse did something that would haunt Mac's dreams for weeks to come. The magnificent black stallion slowly, deliberately lowered himself to his knees. Mac's coffee cup hit the ground, the dark liquid soaking into the pine needles as he stared in disbelief. In 30 years of working with horses, he'd never seen anything like it. Horses didn't kneel to humans. Not wild ones, certainly not stallions who'd clearly never worn saddle or bridle. The position the horse had assumed wasn't one of defeat or submission. There was dignity in the way he held his head, pride in the arch of his neck. This wasn't surrender, it was a request. "What are you asking for?" Mac whispered, taking a tentative step closer. The horse's dark eyes never wavered from Mac's face. In their depths, Mac saw something he recognized with shocking clarity: loneliness. This magnificent creature, born to run free across endless plains, was asking for the one thing Mac understood better than anyone. He was asking not to be alone anymore. Mac stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The black stallion remained kneeling, patient as carved stone, his dark eyes holding Mac's gaze with unwavering intensity. "This isn't real," Mac muttered to himself. "Horses they don't do this." But even as he spoke, Mac found himself moving closer. Something in the stallion's posture, the way he held his proud head, the quiet dignity of his request, called to a part of Mac's soul that had been dormant since the fire. 10 feet away, Mac stopped and studied the magnificent animal more carefully. The scars told stories. A long gash along the shoulder that had healed into a white line, bite marks on the neck from battles with other stallions, wire cuts on the legs from encounters with civilization's boundaries. This horse had lived a hard life, fought for survival every day, yet here he was, making himself vulnerable to a human stranger. "You're hurt," Mac observed, noting fresh wounds that were still seeping blood. "Something's been hunting you." As if in response to his words, the stallion's ears flicked eastward, the direction he'd come from. Mac followed the horse's gaze and felt his stomach tighten. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, he could see dust rising from multiple riders moving fast. "Ah," Mac said grimly, "someone's trying to break you the hard way." He'd seen it before. Men who thought the only way to claim a wild horse was through force and brutality. They'd run the stallion to exhaustion, corner him and try to break his spirit with rope and whip and cruelty. The fact that this horse had escaped and sought out human help suggested his pursuers were both persistent and ruthless. The sound of approaching riders grew closer, and Mac felt the familiar weight of a choice that would define who he was in this moment. He could step aside, let the hunters reclaim their quarry and continue his solitary wandering. Or he could stand between this magnificent creature and whatever cruelty was following him. Mac looked into the stallion's eyes and saw himself reflected there, scarred, weary, but not yet broken. The horse wasn't just asking for protection. He was offering partnership to someone who understood what it meant to survive when the world tried to destroy you. "Get up," Mac said quietly. "If we're doing this, we do it standing." The stallion rose to his feet with fluid grace, never breaking eye contact. As he stood, Mac noticed something else. The horse positioned himself slightly behind Mac's left shoulder, the traditional place for a partner, not a possession. The riders burst into the clearing moments later, 5 men on lathered horses, all carrying ropes and wearing expressions of frustrated anger. Their leader, a heavy-set man with cruel eyes and a silver-handled whip coiled at his saddle, pulled up short when he saw Mac and the stallion. "Morning. Stranger?" the man called out, his tone friendly but his eyes calculating. "That's our horse you got there. Been chasing him for 3 days. Appreciate you holding him for us." Mac felt the stallion's warm breath on his shoulder as the horse moved closer, not from fear, but from trust. The contact was electric, a communication without words that said, "I chose you. Stand with me." "Don't see any brand on him," Mac replied calmly. "Looks wild to me." "Wild horses become property the moment someone decides to claim them," the leader said, his false friendliness fading. "And we claimed this one fair and square. By running him near to death? By cutting him up with wire snares?" Mac's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down worse than 5 bullies with ropes. "How we handle our business ain't your concern, friend. Step aside." Mac felt the stallion shift behind him, muscles coiling for flight if necessary. But the horse didn't run. He waited, trusting Mac to make the choice that would determine both their futures. "Here's the thing," Mac said, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "This horse came to me, asked for my help. Where I come from, you don't turn your back on something that asks for protection." The tension in the clearing ratcheted up like a tightening rope. 5 men with weapons and bad intentions faced one drifter and a wild horse who'd made an impossible choice to trust. "Last chance, stranger," the leader growled. "Walk away." Mac looked back at the stallion, seeing courage and hope and desperate faith in those dark eyes. For the first time in 3 years, someone needed him. Someone had chosen him. "No," Mac said simply. "I don't think I will." The confrontation stretched taut as a bowstring. 5 armed men against 1 drifter and a wild horse who'd somehow formed an alliance born of mutual recognition. Mac could feel the stallion's presence at his shoulder like a warm anchor, steady and trusting despite the danger. "You're making a mistake, friend," the leader said, his hand moving to the coiled whip at his saddle. "That horse is worth more money than you'll see in 5 years of drifting. We've invested 3 days in claiming him." "Investment doesn't create ownership," Mac replied evenly, "and I've seen what your kind of claiming looks like." He gestured toward the fresh wounds on the stallion's hide, the cuts and rope burns that spoke of brutal pursuit. "This horse chose to come to me for protection. I'm inclined to honor that choice." One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Boss, maybe we should just find another horse. This one's more trouble than he's worth." The leader's backhanded slap sent the younger man reeling in his saddle. "We don't back down from some drifter and his pet. That horse is prime breeding stock. I've got buyers in Denver who'll pay $500 for him." Mac felt the stallion tense at the word, breeding, and he understood, with crystal clarity, what these men intended. They didn't want to break the horse to ride. They wanted to break his spirit entirely, reduce this magnificent creature to nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. "500, you say?" Mac mused, as if considering the offer. "That's a lot of money." Hope flickered in the leader's eyes. "Now you're being sensible. Step aside and we'll even give you a finder's fee. Say, $50. Mac nodded thoughtfully, then turned to look at the stallion. The horse's dark eyes held no reproach, no fear of betrayal. There was only patient trust, as if the stallion could see into Mac's heart and knew what answer he would find there. "You know what I think that horse is worth?" Mac said, turning back to face the 5 men. "I think he's worth whatever it costs to keep him free." The leader's face twisted with rage. "Then you're a fool who'll die for a stupid animal." "Maybe," Mac agreed. "But I'd rather die standing with something that chose to trust me than live knowing I sold that trust for money I don't need." The leader reached for his whip. But before he could clear leather, Mac's gun was in his hand, drawn with the smooth speed of a man who'd survived by being faster than his enemies. The other 4 riders found themselves staring down the barrel of a Colt that had never missed what it was aimed at. "Now," Mac said conversationally, "you boys have a choice. You can ride out of here and find some other way to make your $500. Or you can try your luck against someone who's not running scared and exhausted." Behind him, Mac heard the stallion blow softly through his nostrils, not a sound of fear, but something that almost resembled approval. The horse understood the dynamics of this confrontation as clearly as Mac did. The leader's hand hovered over his gun, weighing his chances against a man who'd drawn faster than sight and was now standing with the relaxed confidence of someone completely comfortable with violence when necessary. "You can't watch your back forever." "Stranger," he snarled, "we'll remember this." "I'm sure you will," Mac replied. "But you'll remember it from a distance, or you'll remember it from a grave. Your choice." For a tense moment, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then the younger rider, who'd been slapped earlier, spoke up again, his voice shaky but determined. "Boss, he's right. That horse ain't worth dying over. Let's go find easier money." One by one, the other riders nodded agreement. They'd signed on to chase a wild horse, not to face down a gunfighter who'd proven he was willing to kill to protect what he'd claimed. The leader's face went through several shades of red before settling on a sickly pallor. "This ain't over," he promised. "Yes, it is," Mac said quietly. "Because if I see any of you on my trail again, I won't be talking about choices anymore." As the 5 men rode away, their threats and curses fading into the distance, Mac slowly holstered his gun. The stallion stepped up beside him, close enough that Mac could feel the warmth radiating from the big horse's body. "Well," Mac said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "That was interesting." The stallion turned his great head to look at Mac directly, and in those dark eyes was something that looked remarkably like gratitude, mixed with a new kind of respect. This human had proven himself worthy of the trust that had been offered. In the hours following the confrontation, Mac and the stallion settled into an unusual routine that defied everything Mac thought he knew about human-horse relationships. The big black horse didn't need to be tied or corralled. He simply chose to stay, grazing peacefully near Mac's camp while keeping one ear always tuned to his human protector's movements. "I suppose you need a name," Mac said as he cleaned and bandaged the stallion's wounds with supplies from his saddlebags. To his amazement, the horse stood perfectly still for the treatment, only occasionally flicking an ear when Mac touched a particularly sensitive spot. The horse's behavior was unlike anything Mac had ever experienced. This wasn't a broken animal accepting human dominance. This was a free creature choosing cooperation. Every interaction felt like a conversation between equals rather than the traditional hierarchy of master and beast. "How about Shadow?" Mac suggested, noting how the horse seemed to materialize beside him without sound. "You move like one." The stallion's response was to rest his great head briefly on Mac's shoulder, a gesture of such trust and affection that Mac felt something, long frozen in his chest, begin to thaw. As the day progressed, Mac discovered that Shadow possessed an intelligence that bordered on the uncanny. The horse seemed to understand human speech with remarkable accuracy, responding to suggestions and even appearing to offer opinions through body language and positioning. When Mac began to break camp, Shadow immediately moved to help, using his teeth to pick up scattered gear and dropping it near the pack saddle. When Mac hesitated over which trail to take from the valley, Shadow walked confidently toward the western path, then looked back as if to say, "This way is safer." "You've traveled this country before," Mac realized. "You know these trails better than I do." Shadow's answering whinny seemed to confirm the observation. This horse had roamed free across thousands of miles of Colorado wilderness, learning every canyon, every water source, every safe passage through the mountains. That evening, as they made camp beside a crystal-clear stream, Mac found himself talking to Shadow as he would to a trusted friend. "I haven't had a partner in 3 years," he admitted, stirring beans over the campfire. "Forgot what it felt like to have someone watching your back." Shadow stood nearby, alert to every sound from the surrounding forest, but relaxed in Mac's presence. The horse had taken on the role of sentry without being asked, his keen senses providing early warning of any approaching danger. "You want to know why I've been wandering?" Mac continued, surprised by his own willingness to share. "Had a ranch once. Small place, but it was home. Wife named Sarah who could make biscuits that would make angels weep." Shadow's ears swiveled toward Mac, listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that this story mattered. "Fire took it all," Mac said quietly. "Started in the barn, spread faster than we could fight it. I tried to get Sarah out, but..." He stopped, the words still too painful even after 3 years. "I pulled her from the flames, but it was too late. She died in my arms and I couldn't save her." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. Then Shadow did something remarkable. He walked over and stood close beside Mac, offering the comfort of his presence without judgment or empty words. "That's why I've been running," Mac continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because every place I stayed reminded me of what I'd lost. Every person I met wanted to know my story, wanted to offer sympathy I didn't deserve." Shadow lowered his great head and rested it against Mac's back, a gesture of such gentle understanding that Mac felt tears he'd held back for years finally break free. "But you didn't ask for my story, did you?" Mac said, reaching up to stroke the stallion's neck. "You just asked for help, and you offered the same in return. No questions, no judgment, just partnership." That night, as Mac lay in his bedroll beneath a canopy of stars, he listened to Shadow's quiet breathing nearby and felt something he hadn't experienced since the fire. Peace. Not the empty numbness he'd carried for 3 years, but genuine contentment born of connection with another living soul. When he woke before dawn, Mac found Shadow standing alert at the edge of camp, his body tense with warning. The stallion's message was clear. They were no longer alone in the wilderness. Moving quietly, Mac gathered his weapons and peered into the gray pre-dawn light. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, he could see the flicker of another campfire. The horse hunters had apparently decided not to give up their pursuit after all. "They came back," Mac whispered to Shadow. "Question is, what do we do about it?" Shadow's response was to walk calmly to where Mac's gear was packed, pick up the lead rope from Mac's pack horse in his teeth, and head toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the mountains. The message was unmistakable. "Follow me. I know a way they can't." Shadow led them through country that seemed carved by the gods themselves. Narrow canyon passes where the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side. Hidden valleys where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, and mountain trails so treacherous that one wrong step would mean a fall into infinity. Mac quickly realized that his wild partner possessed knowledge of this wilderness that no human could match. Shadow knew every game trail, every source of water, every cave that could provide shelter. More importantly, he knew paths that horses carrying riders couldn't follow, routes too narrow, too steep, or too dangerous for anyone but a sure-footed mountain horse traveling alone. "You're not just running," Mac observed as they paused at a scenic overlook that gave them a view of their back trail. "You're teaching them that some things can't be caught, only freely given." Far below, Mac could see the dust cloud raised by their pursuers. But the horse hunters were struggling with terrain that Shadow navigated like he'd been born to it. Every time they thought they'd cornered their quarry, Mac and Shadow would vanish through some passage that seemed impossible until you were actually in it. For 3 days, the chase continued through some of the most spectacular country Mac had ever seen. Shadow seemed to take pleasure in staying just ahead of their pursuers, close enough to keep them interested, far enough ahead to remain uncatchable. It was as if the stallion was proving a point about the futility of trying to possess wildness through force. On the 3rd evening, as they made camp in a hidden meadow surrounded by towering peaks, Mac finally understood what Shadow was doing. "You're not just running from them," he said, watching the horse graze peacefully despite the ongoing pursuit. "You're leading them somewhere specific." Shadow's dark eyes held what Mac could swear was amusement. The stallion had been in control of this chase from the beginning, guiding their route with purpose rather than panic. "Where are we going?" Mac asked. Shadow's answer came the next morning when they crested a ridge and Mac found himself looking down into the most beautiful valley he'd ever seen. A pristine lake reflected the surrounding peaks like a mirror, surrounded by meadows that seemed to glow in the morning light. Wild horses, dozens of them, grazed peacefully in the tall grass. "Your family," Mac breathed, understanding flooding through him. "This is your home." Shadow descended into the valley with obvious joy, calling to the other horses with a wild, musical sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The responding calls created a symphony of welcome that made Mac's chest tight with emotion. But as they approached the herd, Mac noticed something that made his blood run cold. These weren't just any wild horses. Many showed signs of recent capture and escape. Rope burns, whip marks, and the hollow-eyed wariness of animals that had been brutalized by humans. "They've been hunting your whole family," Mac realized. "Not just you." An ancient mare approached them, her wise eyes studying Mac with careful assessment. Mac could see the intelligence that Shadow had inherited, the wildness tempered by survival wisdom that had kept this herd free despite constant pressure from those who would claim them. Shadow moved to the old mares, sighed and engaged in what could only be described as conversation, a complex exchange of sounds, and body language that Mac couldn't interpret but clearly understood was significant. When the exchange ended, the mare approached Mac directly. Her gaze held the same intensity as Shadow's but with decades more experience behind it. Mac felt as if he were being examined by a creature whose wisdom exceeded his own. Then, to his utter amazement, the ancient mare also lowered herself to her knees. "No," Mac said quickly, stepping back. "You don't kneel to me. None of you do." But as he looked around the meadow, he saw that the entire herd was watching him with expressions of hope mixed with desperate need. These horses had learned to fear humans, but Shadow had brought them something different. A human who stood with the wild rather than against it. The sound of approaching riders broke the moment. Their pursuers had finally tracked them to this hidden valley, and Mac could see the gleam of avarice in the leader's eyes as he took in the sight of dozens of prime wild horses trapped in a natural corral. Well, the man called out as his riders spread to block the valley's only exit. "Looks like we hit the mother lode. That black stallion led us right to the whole herd." Mac looked at Shadow with new understanding. The stallion hadn't been fleeing his pursuers at all. He'd been leading them into a trap. "But not the kind they expected." "Shadow," Mac said quietly, "I hope you know what you're doing." The stallion's response was to position himself between Mac and the approaching riders, while the rest of the herd began to move with coordinated precision toward positions around the valley's perimeter. Mac realized with growing amazement that he was about to witness something unprecedented. A wild horse herd making a coordinated stand against their would-be captors, led by a stallion who'd chosen a human ally. What happened next defied everything Mac knew about horse behavior and redefined his understanding of courage. As the 5 horse hunters spread across the valley entrance, confident they'd finally cornered their prize, Shadow let out a call that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. The response was immediate and breathtaking. 43 wild horses moved as one, flowing across the meadow like water finding its course. But they weren't fleeing, they were taking positions. Maries with foals moved to the safety of the far end of the valley, while the younger stallions and led mares formed a defensive line behind Shadow. "What in hell?" the lead hunter muttered, his confidence wavering as he realized he wasn't looking at panicked prey, but at an organized resistance. Mac found himself at the center of something that belonged in legend rather than reality. Shadow stood beside him, the stallion's presence a warm anchor in the midst of what was clearly about to become a battle between 2 entirely different philosophies of existence. "They're not just horses," Mac said, his voice carrying across the valley with startling clarity. "They're a family, and families protect each other." The old mare Mac had met earlier stepped forward, her ancient eyes holding wisdom accumulated over decades of survival. When she spoke, and Mac could think of no other word for the complex sounds she made, every horse in the valley listened with the attention accorded to a revered elder. "She's telling them something important," Mac realized, watching the herd's body language shift from defensive to something that looked disturbingly like attack preparation. The lead hunter apparently reached the same conclusion. "Scatter them," he shouted to his men. "Use the whips. Break their formation before they..." He never finished the sentence. Shadow's charge was like watching lightning given form and purpose. The black stallion covered the distance to the mounted men in heartbeats, but instead of attacking, he did something far more effective. He called out in a voice that echoed across the mountains like a war cry. The answering charge came from every direction at once. 43 wild horses, led by the ancient mare and coordinated by Shadow, swept across the valley floor in a display of synchronized power that left the 5 hunters scrambling for their lives. But this wasn't a mindless stampede. Every horse knew exactly what they were doing. They separated the hunters from each other, forced their mounts to panic and bolt, and created a whirlwind of confusion that left the would-be captors on foot and completely overwhelmed. Mac watched in awe as the wild herd demonstrated tactics that would have impressed a military strategist. They didn't hurt the men. They simply made it impossible for them to function as a coordinated threat. Within minutes, the 5 hunters found themselves unhorsed, disarmed, and surrounded by a circle of wild horses whose intentions were unmistakably clear. Leave now, or face consequences you won't survive. This is impossible, one of the hunters gasped, staring up at the magnificent creatures who'd just outmaneuvered them completely. Horses don't... They can't what? Mac asked, walking calmly through the circle of horses to stand over the fallen men. They can't think? Can't plan? Can't choose to fight for their freedom? Shadow moved to Mac's side, his dark eyes fixed on the lead hunter with an expression that mixed contempt with pity. The stallion had just proven that wildness wasn't weakness. It was a form of strength that civilized minds couldn't comprehend. You made a fundamental mistake, Mac continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd just witnessed a miracle. You thought freedom was something you could take by force. But freedom isn't possessed, it's chosen, and these horses chose to fight for theirs. The ancient mare approached the circle, and when she looked at the fallen hunters, Mac saw something in her eyes that made his blood run cold. This was a creature who'd watched humans hurt her family for decades, who'd seen young horses broken and spirit killed for profit. Her patience with human cruelty had reached its limit. You need to leave, Mac said quietly. Now, while she's still willing to let you go. The lead hunter looked into the mare's eyes and saw his own death reflected there. Our horses chose to join the herd rather than carry you anymore, Mac observed. Indeed, the hunters' mounts were now grazing peacefully among the wild horses, showing no inclination to return to their former riders. How do we get out of here without horses? Mac pointed toward the narrow trail that led back toward civilization. You walk. Same way your ancestors did before they learned to steal what wild things wouldn't freely give. As the 5 men stumbled away on foot, their threats and curses echoing off the valley walls, Mac felt Shadow's warm breath on his shoulder. The stallion had risked everything on the belief that one human could be trusted to stand with the wild rather than against it. You knew this would happen, Mac said, understanding flooding through him. You led them here not to trap them, but to show them what they were really up against. Shadow's soft nicker seemed to confirm his understanding. The stallion had orchestrated the entire confrontation to prove a point that no amount of force could make. True partnership was only possible between equals who chose each other freely. The ancient mare approached them, her wise eyes studying Mac with new respect. When she touched her muzzle to his hand, Mac felt as if he'd been accepted into something sacred, a family bound not by blood but by the choice to protect what mattered most. The days following the confrontation in the hidden valley transformed Mac's understanding of everything he thought. He knew about horses, about wildness, and about the nature of family itself. The herd had accepted him with a completeness that humbled him, not as their master but as something far more precious, their chosen protector. Shadow had become more than a partner. He'd become Mac's guide into a world where communication transcended words and relationships were built on trust rather than dominance. Under the stallion's patient teaching, Mac learned to read the subtle language of horse society, to understand the complex hierarchies and relationships that governed herd life. The ancient mare, whom Mac had privately named Wisdom, became his most challenging teacher. She pushed him to think beyond human limitations, to see the world through eyes that valued freedom above safety, connection above possession. She's testing me, Mac told Shadow one evening as they watched the sunset paint the valley walls in shades of gold and crimson, seeing if I really understand what I've been accepted into. Shadow's response was to rest his great head on Mac's shoulder a gesture that had become their evening ritual. The stallion's trust remained absolute, but Mac could sense something building in the herd's dynamics, a decision approaching that would change everything once again. The change came on a crisp morning when Wisdom approached Mac directly, her ancient eyes holding a gravity that made his chest tighten with apprehension. When she began to walk toward the valley's entrance, every horse in the herd fell into formation behind her. "Where are we going?" Mac asked Shadow, but the stallion's expression held the same purposeful determination as the old mare's. The answer became clear as they climbed out of the hidden valley and began following a trail Mac had never seen before. This wasn't a flight from danger, it was a pilgrimage. The herd moved with ceremonial precision, as if approaching something sacred. After hours of climbing through increasingly rugged terrain, they emerged onto a plateau that took Mac's breath away. The flat expanse stretched for miles, covered in grass so rich it seemed to glow in the afternoon light, but it was what lay at the far end of the plateau that made Mac's heart race with understanding. A small ranch nestled against the base of a towering cliff, its buildings weathered but sound, its fences intact but gates standing open. Smoke rose from the chimney, and in the corrals, Mac could see horses, domestic horses that grazed peacefully beside several wild ones. "Someone's already doing what I never imagined possible," Mac breathed. As they approached the ranch, a figure emerged from the main house, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the same wild wisdom Mac had learned to recognize in Wisdom. When she saw the approaching herd, her face lit with joy and recognition. "Shadow," she called out, and the black stallion left Mac's side to gallop toward her with obvious delight. "You brought him." The woman's name was Elena Vasquez, and her story unfolded over coffee and fresh bread as the herd settled into the pastures around her ranch like they owned the place. Which, Mac realized, they essentially did. "My husband started this place 20 years ago," Elena explained, her accented English carrying the music of her Mexican heritage. "He believed wild horses and humans could coexist if we approached them as partners rather than property. When he died 5 years ago, I continued his work." Elena's ranch was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where wild horses could choose to interact with humans or maintain their freedom as they saw fit. Some stayed permanently, becoming partners in the ranch work. Others visited seasonally. All were free to leave whenever they chose. "Shadow's been bringing wounded horses here for 3 years. Elena continued. "He seems to know which ones need healing, which ones need protection, but he's never brought a human before." Mac felt the weight of that observation settle on his shoulders. "Why me?" "Because," Elena said, studying his face with eyes that missed nothing, "you're wounded too, and because Shadow sees something in you that even you don't see yet." That evening, as Mac walked among the horses in Elena's pastures, he began to understand what Shadow had been leading him toward all along. This wasn't just about saving a wild horse from cruel captors. It was about discovering that home wasn't a place you built walls around, but a community you chose to protect. "You want me to stay?" Mac said to Shadow as the stallion appeared beside him in the gathering dusk. "This is what you were asking for that first morning, isn't it? Not just protection from those men, but a partner in something bigger." Shadow's soft nicker seemed to confirm his understanding, but there was something else in the stallion's dark eyes, a question that Mac was only beginning to comprehend. "You're asking if I'm ready to belong somewhere again," Mac realized. "If I'm brave enough to build something instead of just wandering through the ruins of what I lost." The answer came not in words but in the sudden understanding that Elena's ranch represented exactly what he'd been searching for without knowing it, a place where the broken could heal, where the wild could choose domesticity without losing their wildness, where family could be built from choice rather than blood. 3 months later, Mac stood on the porch of what had become his home, watching Shadow lead a group of young colts through their morning training. The black stallion had proven to be not just a remarkable partner, but an exceptional teacher, showing the younger horses how to work with humans while maintaining their wild dignity. Elena's ranch had transformed under Mac's skilled hands. His experience as a rancher, combined with his newfound understanding of wild horse psychology, had created improvements that benefited both the domestic and wild members of their unusual family. New fences that horses could choose to respect or ignore, shelter structures that felt more like natural caves than human buildings, and water systems that mimicked the streams and springs the horses knew from their mountain home. "You've found your calling," Elena observed, joining Mac on the porch with her morning coffee. "James would have loved to see what you've accomplished here." Mac nodded, thinking of Elena's late husband whose vision had created this sanctuary. Shadow knew, didn't he? That first morning when he knelt in front of me. He wasn't just asking for protection, he was recruiting me for this. "Wild horses see things we miss," Elena agreed. "They recognize kindred spirits, wounded souls, people who understand that some things are worth more than money or ownership." The sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the main trail. Mac tensed momentarily, old habits from his wandering days, but relaxed when he recognized the visitors. Agent Morrison from the Territorial Wildlife Office, accompanied by a man in expensive Eastern clothes who could only be one of the government officials Elena had mentioned. "Mrs. Vasquez." "Mr. Calloway," Morrison called out as they approached, "I'd like you to meet Secretary Williams from the Department of the Interior. He's here to see your operation firsthand." Secretary Williams was a thin man with calculating eyes who studied the ranch with obvious skepticism. "Agent Morrison tells me you're running some kind of experimental program here. Wild horses living alongside domestic stock?" "Not alongside," Mac corrected. "As partners." "There's a difference." To demonstrate, Mac whistled softly. Shadow immediately trotted over, followed by 3 other horses. 2 wild mares who'd joined the ranch family and Elena's own gelding, Thunder. The 4 horses arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, clearly alert and attentive but showing no signs of fear or submission. "Remarkable," Williams murmured. "I was told this was impossible." "Most things are impossible until someone proves they're not," Elena replied. "My husband spent 20 years developing these methods. Mac has refined them into something that could be replicated anywhere there's conflict between wild horses and human settlement." Shadow stepped forward then, approaching the secretary with the same measured dignity he'd shown Mac that first morning. Williams instinctively backed away, but Mac's quiet voice stopped him. "He's not going to hurt you. He's offering to meet you. It's an honor. Shadow doesn't extend that courtesy to many people." Williams stood frozen as the magnificent stallion studied him with those intelligent, dark eyes. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Shadow moved closer and gently touched his muzzle to the man's outstretched hand. "Incredible," Williams breathed. "He's completely wild, but he's choosing to trust me." "That's the secret," Mac said. "Trust offered freely is stronger than any rope or bridle. These horses work with us because they want to, not because they're forced to." Over the following hours, Williams toured every aspect of the ranch operation. He watched wild horses working cattle alongside domestic horses, saw colts being gentled through patience rather than breaking, observed the seamless integration of wild and domestic herds that shared pastures and resources without conflict. The territorial government has been struggling with wild horse management for years, Williams admitted as they concluded the tour. "We've tried roundups, relocations, even culling. Nothing has worked long-term." "Because you've been treating symptoms instead of causes," Elena replied. "The horses aren't the problem, the approach is. When you try to dominate wildness, it fights back. When you offer partnership, it chooses cooperation." Williams studied Shadow, who had remained close to Mac throughout the entire visit. "What would it take to implement this model elsewhere?" "Patience," Mac said immediately. "Understanding. And people willing to see horses as partners rather than property." "The government would be interested in funding a pilot program," Williams said slowly. "Several locations, trained personnel, scientific documentation of results." Mac felt Shadow's warm breath on his shoulder as the stallion moved closer. In those dark eyes, Mac saw the same trust that had been offered on that morning months ago, when a wild horse had chosen to kneel before a broken cowboy. "On one condition," Mac said, "the horses get to choose. No force, no coercion. If they decide partnership isn't what they want, they're free to leave. Always." Williams nodded slowly. "Agreed. When can you start?" As the official party prepared to leave, Mac found himself standing once again in the place where his journey had begun, beside Shadow, facing an uncertain future, but no longer alone. "You knew this would happen," Mac told the stallion. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Shadow's response was to rest his great head on Mac's shoulder, the gesture that had become their signature communication. In that touch, Mac felt the completion of a circle that had begun with grief and wandering, but had led to purpose, family, and hope. That evening, as Mac and Elena sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold, the sound of horses moving freely through the pastures created a symphony of contentment that spoke to something deep in Mac's soul. "Sarah would have loved this place," Mac said quietly, speaking his late wife's name aloud for the first time since the fire. "She always said the best things in life came from trust, not control." Elena smiled, understanding the significance of that revelation. "She sounds like she was wise." She was. And she would have understood what Shadow was really asking for that first morning. What was he asking for? Mac watched Shadow emerge from the pasture, moving with the fluid grace that never failed to take his breath away. The stallion approached the porch and settled himself in his favorite spot, close enough to touch but maintaining the dignity that was essentially his. "He was asking if I was ready to love something wild without trying to tame it," Mac said. "If I was brave enough to build a family based on choice rather than ownership. If I could trust enough to let my heart belong somewhere again." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mac reached out to stroke Shadow's neck, feeling the trust that flowed between them like a living thing. The wild horse who had knelt before a lone cowboy had given him something more precious than partnership. He'd given him back the ability to believe in tomorrow. The cowboy who had wandered for 3 years, carrying grief like a weight around his heart, was home at last. Not because he'd found a place to stay, but because he'd learned to love wild things while letting them remain wild, and discovered that some bonds grow stronger when they're freely chosen, rather than forcibly forged.